Hey, what happened to that song you were gonna play for me?
The hymn?
Uh,
They have a rule you can't have music in the prison.
yeah.
Yes, they'll let me play it.
Well, you know the words. You could sing it.
I can't sing.
That's okay. Come on.
If you pass through raging waters of the sea, you shall not drown. If you walk amid the burning flames, you shall not be harmed. If you stand beside the power of hell, and death is at your side, know that I will be there through it all. Be not afraid. I go before you always. Come, follow me. And I will give you rest.
Thank you.
Sister Helen Prejean, what a great honor to have you back with us in Toronto, and especially here at Sultan
No,
Light.
it's great to be here.
Welcome.
Great to
Welcome
be here.
back.
Great to be with you at Regis last night, and then with your mother and your sister Maria. It was wonderful.
Thanks so much. Sister Helen, we just saw those final scenes of that powerful film. Susan Sarandon portrayed Sister Helen Prejean and walking that prisoner to his execution. This has been quite an odyssey for you for the past 14 years since the film hit and since your role in prison ministry. Let's take it back a bit. How did you get involved in prison ministry and how did all of this come about? You talked a little bit about it at Regis College last night.
Mm-hmm. Well, here was the development, the awakening to the gospel of Jesus, and that Jesus was on the side of poor people. And moving into the St. Thomas housing development in New Orleans and being with poor and struggling African American people whom I had only known as our servants when I grew up as a young girl in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And there's a straight connection from being with poor people and going straight to prison and death row, because there's a greased track. And I got an invitation to write to a man on death row, which I did in 1982. Never dreamed he'd be killed. But that man, Patrick Saunier, was the first person that I talk about in Dead Man Walking, and I was with him at his death and witnessed his execution by electrocution. It changed my life forever.
Did you ever imagine, as a young sister of St. Joseph of Madai in Louisiana, a school teacher, a formation director of your community, that one day you'd be in the death house, accompanying not one but 6, and working on your 7th and 8th right now? Did you ever imagine this in the beginning?
Of course not. But I never imagined the dimensions and the power of the gospel when you begin to hook up with the least of these, with the ones, the marginated ones. And it takes you on a current. It's like riding a wave. There's a power in it. And that's the power of the whole story, actually, because to kill people in a society, we have to turn a switch and say they're not human the way the rest of us are, and it's okay to kill some of them in order to protect ourselves. And the heart of it, you know, the gospel of Jesus is, he said the last would be first. The media used to ask me a lot, what are you, a nun, doing getting involved with these prisoners on death row? And I used to say to them, it's the upward mobility in the gospel of Jesus. They didn't get what I meant by the upward mobility. So I stopped saying that to the media. They didn't get it.
This media gets it.
This media gets it, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Remarkable story. You know, you mentioned something last night too, which I found very striking as being a member of a religious congregation. You spoke about the power of what you're doing in the context of a religious community, of the Sisters of St. Joseph. You've lived in community all these years. Sister Margaret Maggio, your companion, a great friend of ours as well.
Yes.
How has the religious community been supportive of you? Why is it so important to do this from a community perspective?
Well, you know, this is a recent awakening in me, Tom, to understand this. A religious community comes up under you and gives you support. you get to do the work of the gospel you really want to do. It gives the community and the underground root system of spirituality and prayer and connectedness. And it summons you. There was a huge debate in our community about social justice that quickened me and awakened me to the gospel of the poor. So you always are in this growth mode together with each other. And then when I came out of the execution chamber, there were our sisters waiting for me to put a coat around me and then to help me heal after witnessing a man be killed in front of my eyes. But the church is that kind of community. There's the religious sisterhood of nuns, but the church community, I get invited all across this world by communities of Christians who are working for the gospel of justice and peace to help it to come. And that community really sustains me.
You've traveled the world, as you've said. You received countless honorary doctorates and degrees and medals and awards. When you look back over the past 14 years particularly, what have been some of the highlights when you connected with the group, when they connected with you?
Yeah.
In some of those big moments and the smaller moments.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you one of them. When you, like the hound of heaven, pestered me until I came to Toronto. It was right after the film. We couldn't have been busier. The invitations are coming from all over the world. And Margaret tells me, there's this priest, this Father Rosica. He keeps calling. It says you got to come to Toronto. I said, Toronto, Canada doesn't even have the death penalty. And so I came to your Newman Center in '96. Remember, it was right after the film. It was right after the Academy Awards, which was the Feast of the Annunciation, the Academy Awards, March 25th, 1996. And then a couple of months later, boom, here I am at the Newman Center with you in Toronto. And then there were connections made all over the place that happened then. That was just very wonderful.
Just to tell our television viewers, too, that the power of those moments, I thought it would be an ordinary lecture in our chapel, which contained or what could hold 400 people. And when we gave out the tickets, 3,500 people showed up for the tickets. We ended up renting Convocation Hall, 1,700 people, another 700 or 800 at the convention center, and then that moving prayer service in which I asked you to do the gospel reflection. And I shall never forget, even the CBC was there to televise it, when you spoke about Jesus on the cross, his arms opened wide on the cross, bringing in the victims and the perpetrators and taking them in himself. Your message of forgiveness has not fallen on deaf ears.
Yeah, but you know, that's the challenge, see. We live in a culture that says when people do these terrible crimes, they are out of the pale, and it's okay for us to do to them what they did to their victim. And it polarizes. In order to be faithful to the victims, you have to kill the perpetrator. The gospel of Jesus embraces victims and perpetrators. Both have dignity. Both need to be heard. Both need to be accompanied and healed. And that's the heart of the challenge of the death penalty issue. And though Canada doesn't have the death penalty, thank God, Canada in '76, when we put the death penalty back by our Supreme Court in the United States, Canada abolished it because of the good work of the churches. Your friend, Tom Maloney?
Arthur Maloney.
Arthur Maloney, yeah. He played a key role because he gave an impassioned speech in Parliament.
1976, that's right.
76. And look at the two roads that have been taken by our two countries. Yeah. We have killed over 1,200 human beings. We've gassed them, shot them, hung them, electrocuted them, lethally injected them. We've been on the death road in the United States. Canada took the life road. Now, you have your challenges, because a lot of bad things happen to people in prison, but you don't have death on the table. And the church has played a big role in that. And that is par excellence the gospel. And the challenge in a culture that wants to use violence to create social order or to remedy the wrongs that have been done. And so this message of the death penalty is really at the heart of what kind of society we're going to have. Pro-life society or pro-death.
Let's talk about that pro-life society, because one of the very important messages you brought to us last night at the University of Toronto at Regis College was exactly that topic of pro-life, and how at a certain moment in the pro-life movement, the topic of the death penalty was not part of the whole picture. When did it become a part of that picture? Who was responsible for that, and what difference has it made?
Yeah, well, you know, and I understand because I've been carrying on this conversation and discourse with people. It's really understandable when people say, well, unborn babies are innocent and millions are aborted. So this is the moral issue of our day. It's innocent life being killed. Death penalty, they did it. When we know they're guilty, then they are paying the consequences, and God's also a God of justice. Mm-hmm. So the two were never meeting, and our Pope John Paul played a huge role in this.
How did he do that?
Well, I want to just make clear that dialogue was happening all over the church. Catholic bishops in the Philippines, the Canadian bishops, many bishops' groups were getting it, of course, from the people that human rights was gaining an ascendancy, which Pope John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris referred to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the beacon of the future. So it's in the air, it's in the discourse about human rights. So could you ever take someone for a crime and kill them? Mm-hmm. There has to be no exceptions. So I did get to be a part of that dialogue with Pope John Paul through a man in Virginia. His name is Joseph Odell, who was killed by Virginia. He was innocent, I believe. It's in my second book, Death of Innocence. And through this man in Virginia, where Italy got involved, I got to have a dialogue with the Pope. I got to deliver a letter to him, which they put right into his hands. And what I did was I brought 14 years of pastoral experience of being with people executed right into the heart of the Pope and appealed to him as a pastor. And I said, Your Holiness, we need the church to take a strong principled stand against the death penalty. Does the church only uphold the dignity of innocent life? What about guilty life? And when I'm walking with a man to execution, and he's shackled hand and foot, and he says, Sister, please pray that God holds up my legs as I walk to my death. I said, there is no dignity in this death. It was one of the points I made in the letter to the Pope. And what the Pope did was he looked at the catechism. He was reviewing it for the definitive edition. This happened in January 1997. And he cut out of the catechism, he changed the teaching on the death penalty to bring it up to a level of human rights for everyone. And he cut out the criteria the church had used, that for grave or grievous crimes the state could execute. Cut 10 words out of the catechism, changed everything, because what it says is, no matter how grave or grievous the crime, we have prisons, a way to defend society, so we don't kill anymore. And it changed everything. He did it.
And there's a little historical point here, which is linked, I believe, to your coming to the University of Toronto, that a year after you came, in May of 1997, I invited then, as I was the director of the Newman Center, I invited Cardinal Pio Laghi to come and to present the horizons and limitations of the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And just before the Cardinal came, he phoned me and said, I'd like to use that occasion, because it was in Convocation Hall, hundreds of people, I'd like to announce the final emendation or changes in the Catechism, especially regarding the death penalty.
Wow.
And it was there on the same stage, the same microphone, the same podium, that he announced that to the world public. And it went out from here. Origins published it, all kinds of people published it, and they announced that this change had happened. You know, I don't think any of this is by accident or coincidence. This is a divine pen that's writing all these stories and the places and using the players.
Yeah. And when you tell it from the human point of view, starting from Mary onward, you know, she treasured all these things in her heart. And our cooperation, our saying yes. But you do sense that divine grace. Grace comes up under us, and we move and we speak and we act. I do have to tell you, though, about Cardinal Pio Laghi. See, I had heard that there was a change in the catechism, but they sent me all the Italian newspapers. I can't figure out, what's the change? What's the change? Then you, Pio Laghi made the announcement, and you sent me the first English that I ever had.
Right.
Oh, this was the change.
That's right.
I didn't know what it was until you sent me that.
No, it's amazing. I want to read one of my favorite quotes from Dead Man Walking, which I have gone back to countless times these past years. I've used it for my own prayer. I've used it in biblical meditations. It's just at the end of the book when you talk about one of the real heroes in the book, a man named Lloyd LeBlanc, who was the father of one of the victims killed by one of the men you accompanied to the electric chair. This is what you wrote at the end of that incredible book. Lloyd LeBlanc has told me that he would have been content with imprisonment for Patrick Sonnier, who murdered his own son, he went to the execution not for revenge, but hoping for an apology. And I quote, "Patrick Sonnier had not disappointed him. Before sitting in the electric chair, he said, 'Mr. LeBlanc, I want to ask your forgiveness for what me and Eddie done.' And Mr. LeBlanc had nodded his head, signaling a forgiveness that he had already given. He says that when he arrived with the sheriff's deputies there in the cane field to identify his son, he knelt by his boy, laying down there with his two little eyes sticking out like bullets, and prayed the Our Father. And when he came to the words, 'Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us,' he had not halted or equivocated, and he said, 'Whoever did this, I forgive them.' But he acknowledged that it's a struggle to overcome the feelings of bitterness and revenge that well up, especially as he remembers his son David's birthday year by year and loses him all over again. David at 20, David at 25, David getting married, David standing at the back door with his little ones clustered around his knees, grown-up David, a man like himself, whom he will never know." And you concluded the book, "Forgiveness is never going to be easy. Each day it must be prayed for and struggled for and won." What an incredible thought. What's the journey of forgiveness that's taken place inside of you, having seen all this? And what are some of the pitfalls and some of the blunders that took place as you arrived at this point?
Yeah, well, first, of course, because I was with a man on death row, and then I gradually found out about the crimes, I didn't reach out to the victims' families at first. I didn't know how to reach out to the victims' families. I thought, they'll never want to see me. I'm the spiritual advisor to the ones who killed their loved ones. It was a terrible mistake. And Lloyd LeBlanc was the one who taught me, because he said, "Sister, where have you been all this time?"
In the courtroom, huh?
Well, with the two brothers, but you never once came to see us. He was the one, he was grace. He said, "I pray in this little chapel, come pray with me." And then he's the one who brought me through. He's the hero of Dead Man Walking. I'm the storyteller. And a big blunder by not reaching out. He taught me, and he brought me into the inner workings of his heart, of how with God's grace, he could move from this, everybody telling him he had to be for the death penalty, and a part of him that would rise up inside and say, "Yeah, I want to see him dead," to, "Oh no, they killed our son, but I'm not going to let them kill me, and I'm going to do the forgiveness that Jesus," and he made his way there on that road. And where his heart was revealed was kneeling by the body of his son there in that cane field and saying the Our Father. But it's a journey. Forgive us in the Our Father was a journey. Forgiveness is a path. It's not one act. And we need grace under us at every step of the way. He showed that to me. He's the hero. And so it's not about my forgiveness of anyone. I haven't been the one hurt. But the compassion that he exemplifies is what has to teach us all. That to go down this road of asking for an eye and a death for a death can never heal us as a society, and can never bring us anywhere except further down the road of death.
Why is it important that those who claim to be pro-life have a consistent ethic of life from the earliest moments to the final moments and everything in between?
Everything about life is a gift given us. None of us create ourselves, and we must protect and uphold the preciousness of life from birth until natural death. The innocent life, little children, not just children before they're born, children after they're born. Healthcare is a pro-life issue. Visiting prisoners is a pro-life issue. Human trafficking is a pro-life issue. The homeless in the streets is a pro-life issue. Kids are on the street, pro-life issue. All of it is pro-life. Jesus said, "I've come that you may have life to the full." All of life. And so the seamlessness of it, the consistency of it, and that's one of the beauties of being a Catholic, is that we can be for life across the board, not only innocent, but guilty as well.
It's a very important message. You know, you're going to be addressing the Catholic school chaplains of the province of Ontario tonight and tomorrow at their conference being sponsored by the York Catholic District Board up in Hockley Valley. What message are you going to give to teachers, to educators, to chaplains who are not in a country where the death penalty exists? But what's the message you're going to give them about your work and about the mission that's been entrusted to you?
You know, it's interesting, Father Tom, because more and more I am being brought together with teachers. I've done a lot with the teachers in England, and those that are working with young people in our society, our young Catholics, they are looking for that wave on which to put their boat, a purpose in their lives, to give themselves over to something big. The gospel of Jesus that calls us into the lives of the poor and into the work of justice for human rights, for all the needs of people who still struggle in our society. It's to do the works of justice. It's to do the works of compassion. So I look forward, because see, I'm still a teacher. I wanted to be a teacher in the classroom, but my classroom just got a little bit bigger, that's all.
Right.
And the movie, of course, did that for me. They said, what's it like for a nun to be in a movie with the Academy Award? You know what it means? We just do more work. That's all it means. Nuns work, right? We work.
That's right.
I pray and I work.
I know the feeling.
Teachers work.
Yeah.
Teachers are in that classroom. Teachers are with young people. And to excite them, to turn them on to the big challenges of the gospel, which is the hungry are fed, the homeless are sheltered, the naked are clothed, the prisoners are visited. That's what I want to share with the teachers.
What's been one of the most significant moments of the past 14 years that's happened to you post Dead Man Walking?
This is like the resurrection stories, huh? Because the first dead man walking was Jesus, and we're still in the season of resurrection here,
right,
and coming out of the grave. And I've reflected on that a lot. The power of the gospel. When I'm one little part of this story, but I'm not the gospel. The gospel's much bigger than me. And the power you feel under you. And you know how the gospel stories record that people were in awe at the awesome deeds of God. And when we do the gospel and when we live it, I'm in constant awe of what God does in us. There's so many needs. You know, we can't sit on our duffs. Well, I wrote the book and no. There are people, most people on death row in the United States are unvisited. They're alone and abandoned. Many people in prison here. What's going on with the juveniles, especially those with mental problems? It calls to us because they're alone and they're suffering and they're abandoned and they're considered scum or less than human, and they call to us.
Would you encourage people to visit prisoners?
You're allowed an understatement on this program. Jesus, it's the call of Jesus. See, prisons, once people are put in these places, they aren't seen, they become invisible. Their suffering becomes invisible. Their needs becomes invisible. And the gospel of Jesus is always calling us to cross boundaries. Those of us that live in nice neighborhoods and go to good schools, what's the call to us? We have health care. We have our needs taken care of. What's the call to do the gospel today? We have to cross those boundaries and go over to where people are, who many times are shunned, are thought less of than the rest of us, or we're afraid of them. Don't go hang out with those street people. They're going to kill you. They're going to mug you. That's the call. That's what it is. And it's always going to be beckoning to us. It can never be enough because the needs are so great. You know my favorite part of the scriptures, one of them, before Jesus, is that burning bush. When Moses was in Midian, having a good life, tending the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro, sees a bush burning, goes close, and the first revelation of the heart of God in the book of Exodus, I have heard the cry of my people. So it's all about hearing the cry and then responding.
That Bible belt runs through you, boy, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing. Sister, one last question. Obviously, the scriptures, the sacraments, the experience of the church have been a source of inspiration for you.
Absolutely.
And we hear from different voices in the church that it's not an inspiration and people are turned off, and many women religious have felt hurt or disenfranchised or separated. Offer them a word of hope and offer the church a word of hope in these very difficult times? Why is it important to stick to the sacraments, to stay close to the Word of God, and to be part of the church?
The sacraments, when we stay close, like Eucharist, my Eucharistic community is an African-American community in New Orleans. I am part of Eucharist on Sunday that does justice. We must find and be part of the liturgy of the church, especially like Eucharist and the sacraments. And we have to call that community and be part of calling it to justice. Sacraments and liturgy alone, without connecting it to the living work of the gospel of justice. And it's always a call of conversion. When we love our church, we keep discoursing and dialoguing with our church. And we have to be a part of the change. We need to raise those questions, and we need to raise them honestly, where some people, simply by virtue of being a woman, simply by being virtue of who they are disenfranchised. We have to call for it, just like Paul called for it. No more Jew and Gentile, no more male and female. We have to keep the discourse going. But we don't want to deprive ourselves of the life of the church. But then we work for change within it. When you love a community, you work to change it. Just like anyone in a marriage or anyone in a relationship where there are difficulties and conflicts, you stay in the discourse and you help it to change.
Thanks for that. That's a very powerful answer for all of us. For me, especially, why to belong to this church? Why is it important to stick with it? When I introduced you last night to that wonderful crowd at Regis College, I ended my words of introduction by saying we're in the Easter season, and the scripture passage that kicked off the Easter season this year was the early morning scene at the tomb in Luke's Gospel, where we hear the apostles saying, "Some women from our group astounded us." And I think I could say that on the part of many in the church, many men, many women, many young people, when they discovered your story in the book, Dead Man Walking in 1993, in the subsequent film, in the magnificent opera that'll be opening in Houston in January 2011, in your second book about the innocent, and in your third book about to come, people discovered a woman who's astounded us. Not because she's a woman, not because she's a sister of St. Joseph, not because she went to the Oscars, but because she's allowed herself to be seized by the gospel, and she's doing something about it. And the story is ancient and it's ever new. When people are captivated by God, they astound us.
And I do what women do. I point to women. I'm going to be in Pakistan. I'm going to be with women in Pakistan who are standing up for human rights and helping each other. I point to women. I point to women on death row. I point to other women. It's what women do. We network. We connect. We know it's never just about us.
Sister Helen Prejean, thank you for gracing this set and our television network, and thanks for bringing back those powerful memories of 1996.
Yeah, fantastic.
I know we're going to connect again because what began here has had many, many different iterations, and the story continues.
And the power, it keeps unfurling. That's when you know, when you hit that wave of the power that continues to unfurl, you know you hit the gospel.
Thank you.